How much blame does President Trump deserve for the Pittsburgh Synagogue shooting? Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Heather Godwin. Joining us today are Zaid Jilani of the Intercept, Michael Shindler of Young Voices, and Kayla Stetzel, also of Young Voices. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to have all of you here this
thanks for having me.
This week, President Trump paid a visit to the site of the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, but not everyone welcomed him. Here's the story from ABC News.
Protesters packed the blocks around the Tree of Life synagogue as a somber President Trump paid his respects at the ceremony he called very sad, very moving. But throughout the somber memorial, the protests continued, with demonstrators gathered in the neighborhood nearby shouting at the president, saying words matter.
You don't belong here! This is our neighborhood!
Zaid Jilani, we'll start with you, reporter for the Intercept. So this seemed to be a situation where Trump was darned if he did and darned if he didn't. What do you think the best approach would have been?
Well, I think, it's there probably is an attempt to try and, it's hard to connect the dots one-to-one and say, well, President Trump has inculcated a certain atmosphere, so therefore this person did this. I don't think you can do that in a fair manner, but I do think President Trump should think hard about encouraging an attitude of us versus them. I think that, political violence is very rare in the United States, but when it does happen, it tends to happen from someone who's very aggrieved, who's somewhat unstable, and they tend to have an us versus them attitude. And that's not only in this case, but perhaps in the individual who sent the pipe bombs in Florida, perhaps what happened last year with the individual who shot up the congressional baseball game, who was on the other side of the political aisle. I think when you inculcate that sort of mentality, you start forgetting that the other people on the other side of the aisle are human beings, and no matter how strong of disagreements you have with them, violence won't solve anything. And I think that's something that as a leader, I think he should be stressing. Whereas I think often he thinks more about his own immediate reputation and attacks against him and what people think about him. He should be thinking about everyone. So I think that would be the mentality I'd urge him to adopt.
Well, what about his visit there? That was what I was referring to and saying it seemed, there was a no-win situation. Do either of you have an opinion about whether he should have made that visit?
I think it was warranted. I mean, we just experienced one of the worst, I think the worst attack on Jewish citizens on American soil ever. So it absolutely required some sort of acknowledgement by the president. A visit, I think, was in a good faith gesture. And while I agree with what Zaid said, I wish that he was met with perhaps a little bit more civility, because I feel we are in this crossroads as a nation, and we're getting to become more and more polarized. And I think perhaps Trump wanted to extend a little bit of olive branch, and while he may have had at least some small influence on the culture surrounding kind of the violent rhetoric in the media, he did extend an olive branch by going out there, and I feel like he should have been received at least a little bit more warmly.
And Michael Shindler, what's your opinion?
I do think that in the clip, when the woman said, "We don't want you here," is important. It's important because Trump, by going there to visit, says, it doesn't matter whether or not you want me there. I'm your leader. I'm the president. We are a cogent body politic. I have to be there. Right? We're going to get through this together, whether you like that or not. And I think that's important. I'm glad that he did that.
So how do you think that he is being perceived now that he's come and gone? This seems to be an ongoing conversation. What can he do now?
I think that what he can do now is to help the people move on. Trump comes from a family with a lot of Jewish members. He has a lot of Jews in his administration. What he needs to do to move on is to say anti-Semitism is not okay. We don't condone any of these attacks. Well, what we do is come together and stay together as a community of blacks, whites, Jews, Hispanics, etc., but all Americans.
Kayla Stetzel, what's your opinion?
I mean, I do agree, but also I feel like we're not going to get that response. I think the very day of the tragedy, or shortly after, I know he made some comments in the day acknowledging the sadness and the scope of the tragedy, but I think that evening he was already kind of making jokes at some rallies, right? And I think just our ability to collectively grieve as a country has become very stifled. It seems within only like about 12 hours of that happening, both sides of the aisle were trying to point fingers and place blame, which is just really depressing to me, right? 12 people lost their lives, and these were old, very religious, devout people. They're kind of people you see who go to church early at their worship services. And as a nation, we barely had time to grieve them. Everybody was so ready to kind of see how this would affect the midterms, and I feel like that's very unfortunate.
And Zaid, Jilani, how do you think he could turn this around?
Well, it's difficult because we're in a midterm environment where the election's a week away, and I think people want to point fingers and do the blame games because they believe the greater outcome of whatever happens in the election is really where their priority should be. So it's difficult. I don't think we can expect President Trump and the Democrats to stop engaging in politics against each other, but I guess the question is, can't they do it in a way that says, hey, this is a disagreement about ideas. We don't actually view each other as enemies. And I think that's really the important thing that both of them need to be stressing right now. Because, it's not realistic for us to expect them to stop campaigning. And the issues that matter before the election are very, very important. It wouldn't be right for them to stop campaigning. But I think they need to do it in a way that is inclusive, in a way that stresses this is about our difference in visions. We don't actually think of each other as enemies. We're all Americans.
Well, it's interesting that you all talk about the effect on the midterms. Do you really think this is going to have an effect on the midterms, or do you think people have already made up their mind?
I don't feel it will have any effect. I think both sides are very galvanized right now, and I think this tragedy really kind of exists outside of the sphere of the midterms, in my opinion.
I find it interesting that the same thing with the bomber occurred with the synagogue, where for a minute he was able to watch his language, and then he went right back to saying, George Soros is paying for all of these people to be in this caravan. And it seems like, with the same shooting, that he returned to his rhetoric pretty quickly. Michael Shindler, what do you think?
Well, that's fine. In fact, I wrote a great article about this in the American Conservative called What's Wrong with Trump's Tweets? And the sort of issue that I think that's important that we're not looking at right now, which we should, is his tone appropriate to what he's talking about at a given time? When people mourn, they use the language of mourning. When people attack, they use the language of attack. And I think that his tone is often appropriate to the type of message that he conveys at a given moment.
Voting rights. So
Great. All right. Well, thank you all this evening. And that's all for this week. I'm Heather Godwin, and thank you for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.